is. We're going to let Dr. Toya get us out here to do the format. Thanks, Dr. Toya.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Before we start, let me just talk very briefly about the format of tonight's debate. We will begin with opening statements from both of the participants, and I think I remember that Dr. Brook was going to go first with those. After those 7-minute opening statements, I will ask 3 questions of both Dr. Brook and Dr. Smith, and they don't know the questions, by the way, although they probably have some idea. I don't even know them totally yet, because it depends on what they say in their opening statements. But just to let you know that these are blind to them. They'll have 3 questions from me, and each response will be a maximum of 4 minutes, with a maximum of 2-minute rebuttal for each of them. That will get us to, we think, somewhere around about 50 minutes, and then hopefully we can sort of rid ourselves of some of these rigid rules and just have a sort of free-for-all Q&A session with you as well. So, to get us started, we'll have the opening statements, and for 7 minutes, Dr. Brook, why don't we start with you?
Stopwatch.
Yeah, I've got the stopwatch as well, and I have high-tech things to let them know when time is there.
Okay, so I'm obviously here to defend the proposition that capitalism is superior to a mixed economy. I would argue capitalism is superior to any other political social system. But let me start, because there's always a lot of confusion about this, let me start by defining or describing what I mean by capitalism, because capitalism is a term thrown around all the time. What I mean by capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism. It is the system of private property. It is the system in which all property is privately held. And I don't just mean symbolically privately held. That is, you've got a little diploma that says that you own the property. But I mean that you have use of that property, the full meaning of property. You can dispose of it, you can use it as you see fit, not as your neighbors see fit or as some government regulator sees fit. So I'm for a system of government, capitalism, which is free of state regulation, free of government control. It is laissez-faire. Leave it alone. Leave us alone. Hands off. A complete, if you will, separation of state from economics. The state has no role in economic life, in our economic life. That's what I mean by capitalism. So when capitalism is blamed for the financial crisis, it can't be so, because capitalism didn't exist in 2007. There was no capitalism. We can argue about what caused the financial crisis, but it wasn't laissez-faire capitalism. So now the question is, does this system work? And I want to answer 2 aspects of this. One, does capitalism produce the goods? Is it efficient? Does it work from a purely economic perspective? And then, to me, the more important question of, is capitalism good? Is it right? Is it moral? Is it just? Which, to me, is the much more important question at the end of the day. And I'll try to do all this in the 5 minutes or whatever remaining. On the question of does it work, to the extent that it is tried, and granted, capitalism in the pure form has never really been tried, but to the extent that it's been tried, to the extent that a country or society has gotten close to a situation where property is private, where businesses and individuals are left alone, it thrives. Not only is it a success, it is an amazing success. It is what has allowed all of us to rise out of poverty. If you think 250 years ago, we were all poor. 99% of the people were poor. It has allowed the creation of all the kind of the material wealth at the base, at the foundation. That is this system that is driving that. Countries that tilt more towards capitalism, again, the pure form is not being tried, tend to be more successful than countries that have a mixture that tilts away from capitalism. So capitalism is a system that produces the goods. It creates wealth. It helps us all rise up from, as I said, I think the poor are the greatest beneficiaries of capitalism, of anybody. The poor benefit more than anybody else. it's not only that we can look at history and we can look kind of a cross-sectional at a variety of different countries and see the success of markets when they're allowed to work. But I also think that from an economic perspective, we understand the theory of why they work. And I'm not going to articulate the theory now, but markets, we understand why markets work. What is it about incentives? What is it about human behavior? What is it about the way information is transported? What is it about prices? What is it about all these things that make it possible for markets to deliver the goods? This has been well understood, I think well understood for a long time, at least since the days of Adam Smith. In my view, the primary objection to capitalism that drives whatever economic objections come up, the primary objection to capitalism is always a moral objection. It is always an objection rooted in morality or justice or fairness and so on. And so let me make my second to last point. I believe capitalism is moral. I believe it's just. I think it's the only economic system that is moral and just. Why? Because it is the only system that allows people to pursue their own lives, to pursue their own values, to pursue their own happiness freely. It leaves them alone to do so. It is the only system that extracts from human relationships force, coercion, the enemy of freedom, the enemy of happiness, the enemy of human reason, the enemy of our ability to pursue values. So capitalism is a system that says, no coercion, we're leaving you alone. And let me be clear, government has a role in capitalism, and that role is to protect property rights and protect us from bad guys, from crooks, from frauds, from Bernie Madoffs. Other than that, it is a system of voluntary exchange. It is a system where people voluntarily choose to associate or not associate, trade or not trade, exchange or not exchange, give charity or not give charity. It is a system where people voluntarily pursue their own life, their own happiness, their own success. And therefore, as such, since my standard of morality, the standard for me for morality, and this is again different than the conventional sense, moral to me means that which is consistent with human life, that which allows human life to flourish, that which allows individual human life to flourish. To me, the enemy of morality in this context is force. So this is a system that allows individual human life to flourish, to be successful, for people to pursue their values. It doesn't mean it guarantees anybody anything, right? It doesn't guarantee you happiness. It allows you the freedom to pursue that happiness. Let me just end on this. When we talk about a mixed economy, it's a mixture of what? And I think fundamentally, essentially, a mixed economy is a mixture of freedom and coercion. It's some property rights, some freedom, some do what you will to pursue your own values, and some, I'm going to tell you how to live, I'm going to tell you what to do, I'm going to tell you how much sugar to consume, I'm going to tell you what to do, what you can and cannot do with your property. So it's a mixture of freedom and coercion at the bottom, at its fundamental. I'm for freedom. I'm against coercion, and therefore I'm for a pure form of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brook. It should be on radio because it came in exactly 7 minutes. Dr. Smith.
All right, so I am here to defend the mixed economy, and like capitalism, it's kind of hard to define, so I was going to let Dr. Brooks go first, and then basically build my defense off of that. I pretty much knew he was going to be to the right or to the more leather than whatever I want to support, so I had to start there. But I want to lay a base of the things that we probably agree on. We probably agree that in general, free markets are a productive way to produce goods and services. We probably agree in general that directing services from the government has a severe problem of knowledge, the accumulation of knowledge, and the usage of knowledge, most articulated by Hayek. We probably agree that a system of state control has problems producing the right incentives. And we probably agree, even though a person can bring this up, that there are public choice problems involved with government directing production. The government has to have some way of deciding what it does, and that way can always be corrupted. Where we disagree, I think, is can we improve on something that's extremely laissez-faire? And so I didn't know exactly where he was going to land on what I sometimes think of as like a Nozick, Hayek, Mrs. Rothbard spectrum. I think there's somewhere in the Mrs. spectrum, maybe. Rand. Well, wait, yeah, so Rand, now I'm a little confused. So there's some issues, some of which I think you may accept, and so I won't spend too much time on that. But I think there are places where we can improve on this sort of completely laissez-faire system. The first issue that we have is enforcing the property rights themselves, and I think Dr. Brooks is going to give on that. And the problem there is that without some sort of government to enforce property rights, you naturally evolve into a feudalistic system. You naturally evolve into a system where the people who are in the business of enforcing the law gain all the rent from society. They take all the rent from society. So the knights or the samurai or whoever is in the business of enforcing the law takes all the rent. And so unless you have a democratic or otherwise sort of popularly owned government that enforces the law, you're going to default to some sort of feudalistic system. But I think you may give on that one. So then I'll move back to what I think are some other problems with that. One is a general issue of unwritable contracts. And so the notion that everyone can decide for themselves and live their life how they want is wonderful, and we think that free markets usually produce the most productive outcome. But there are some cases where individuals have trouble entering into the agreements that they want. And the most obvious case of that is children. And so children have a difficult time entering into long-term contracts, and one of the contracts that children might want to enter into is to borrow money to fund their education so that they'll be more productive later. But a child can't go, a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old can't go to the bank and take out a loan and say, I'm going to pay for preschool, and then I'm going to pay for elementary school, and then I'm going to pay for going on to high school. And so the child's at a fundamental disadvantage there in that he can't enter into a contract that would promote both the child's interest and the interest of the lender. And so there's a role for government to step in and say, well, we'll fund the child's education with the understanding that we'll get the money back later in taxes. And often felt sentiment is that, well, we can leave that to the parents, but you run into the problem that the interest of the parents and the interest of the child are not necessarily the same. So people often have children and are bad parents, and they don't care about their children, or they're neglectful of their children, and without some way to solve this fundamental contract problem, there's no way for the child to get out of that situation. There's no way for them to say, okay, my parent isn't willing to fund my education, so by gosh, I'm going to go and raise the capital to fund my own education. And so by providing for that, the state can improve that. We have the same issue in lots of cases of healthcare. People are born with congenital diseases that they can't insure against, so you can't write an insurance contract, you can't enter into a health insurance contract before you're born. And once you're born, you already have some disposition towards good health or dispositions towards bad health. That makes it difficult to write healthcare contracts. And so throughout history, writing healthcare contracts has always been problematic. Healthcare is, for most of its early history, was funded by charitable organizations like the church, then later municipalities, and then later federal governments. But there's always been a difficulty establishing a fully fledged private market in health insurance, and even in the places that it is or was established, like in the United States, it was done with extreme government intervention. And that's largely because it's difficult for people to enter into contracts regarding their health when, as soon as they're born, they're either in a healthy status or an unhealthy status. It's very difficult to insure against it, or you're predisposed towards having certain diseases or predisposed towards not having certain diseases. So unwritable contracts and adverse selection into either being healthy or not healthy is a fundamental problem without having any sort of government intervention at all. Then we went into the problem of externalities, which I'm sure Dr. was ready to address. So we have pollution. It's the most common externality that we think of. So when people have a factory, they put smog into the air, they put other pollutants into the air, and it's very difficult for the market system to solve that problem. It's very difficult for all the people who are affected by pollution to somehow get together and negotiate with the factory owner to get rid of the pollution. And so there's a potential role for government to step in and say, here is, on the extreme case, here are some rules and regulations to reduce pollution, or perhaps even we can create an artificial market in pollution permits that can help us solve this problem. But that's government sort of adding on to the natural market. Pollution can be a very, very big deal. One of the major challenges facing humanity right now is climate change, which is pollution in carbon dioxide and methane. At the same time, congestion is a similar sort of problem, and it's difficult to think of congestion and traffic congestion as being huge deals, but they are some of the fundamental limits to the growth of cities and the growth of increasing returns to scale and prosperity. And so the government funding of roads to reduce congestion, the government funding of sewers to reduce the congestion of human waste has been instrumental in the growth of cities and the expansion of the productive capacity that comes from cities. I see I don't have much time, so I'll try to be quick. There are then sort of more complex moral issues that I'm just going to touch on really briefly that you might have on, which is that you don't feel that Dr. Brooks's sort of theory of morality captures everything. And the two areas I'm going to touch on: self-congruency. So people have a fundamental issue that you as a 20-year-old and you as a 60-year-old are kind of the same person, but kind of not. And how willing you accept that, might depend on a long conversation about what it means to be a human, what it means to have self-congruency. But the fact is that Social Security and other programs which sort of induce people to save are very popular among the people who themselves are induced to save. And it's hard to explain that unless the 20-year-old and the 50-year-old are somehow slightly different people. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. I obviously look menacing. Thank you, Dr. Smith. So now we're going to get into a question and answer. I have three questions that I've just sort of scribbled down here and revised from ones I came in with for the participants. And we'll start with Dr. Smith. And answers to these questions are 4 minutes and each. And then we'll go with 2-minute follow-ups. I will start the first question with Dr. Smith, and then the second question with Dr. Brook, and then the third question with Dr. Smith. My first question is, which one shall I ask? Why don't we do this one? We tend to believe that equality and justice have some kind of value. What does your system say about these two principles, the principles of equality and justice?
That's very broad, but I think the easiest way to tie that in is to say that there is some value to equality in and of itself, and the reason we might care about whether or not people had, to some extent, equal outcomes in life is because there are lots of things about people's entrance into life that they have no control over. So, as I talked about before, you have no control over the quality of your parents, and that can make a big impact on a child's future if they are born with bad parents. But on an even deeper level, life itself and coming into the world is something that you're not asked, and you're given an endowment of genes and abilities and talents, and there's no sort of accounting for the talents that you're born with. So some people of no particular fault will be born less intelligent, less attractive, less able to make their way in the particular market society that they were born into. At other times, people will be born more attractive or more intelligent and capable in the market economy they were born into. And they'll reach radically different outcomes and radically different levels of satisfaction and happiness from their life based on accidents of birth. And one way we can see that as being particularly arbitrary is in how the information revolution has made such a difference in the people who were born with highly technical, highly specialized abilities. And so people who were on autistic end of the spectrum, born in the 1940s and 1950s, had a pretty rough time in life. Maybe if you were particularly capable, you would become some sort of an engineer, work in thermodynamics. But in general, the quarterback really did become successful. As technology and as electronics expanded rapidly, that rapidly increased the returns to being slightly skewed on the autistic end of the spectrum, and people born that way have done very, very well in the last 30 or 40 years. But there's no particular reason why we think the morality of being born slightly on the autistic spectrum has changed in that time, even though the returns have changed dramatically. And so by luck of the draw, if you were born in the 30s when the return was low, You had a rough time of it. If you were born in 2000, return to time, you had a really great life, a really great time of it. And so there's some interest in saying, well, since I don't know where I'm going to be born, and since I don't have any control over that, maybe we should do a little bit to sort of ensure against being born at the wrong time, being born with the wrong skills that are won in that particular moment in history, and that way everyone can be spared the risk of having a particularly unproductive life or miserable life. And so that's sort of the value of equality in this time frame, if that helps. I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Same question.
Yeah, same question, Dr. Brook, for 4 minutes.
I know it's a shock, but we're all unequal. No matter what you do, we're all unequal. We'll always be unequal. That's just nature. Call it luck, call it whatever you want. It's a fact of reality. And I don't put any moral claim on that. It just is. Some people are born with certain skills and other people are born with other skills. A lot of the skill that we actually see of us as adults, I don't believe is an issue of luck. I think luck is generally overestimated in our culture. It's a matter of choices. It's a matter of decisions. I'm a strong believer in free will. So I don't put any credence in the idea of equality. I think equality is a bogus notion. I think it's a bad idea. The only way, I mean, this is the way I think about equality. Michael Jordan and me playing basketball. How do you make us equal? Well, there's only one way to make us equal. Break his legs, and you probably have to break his arms as well, because he's that good, right? That's the only way to achieve equality, and that's what it means when we talk about equality. So taking people's money to give to somebody else is breaking their legs, right? They worked hard for that money. It's part of their blood, sweat, and tears. There's no difference between breaking somebody's legs and stealing their money to give to somebody else. So the only way to achieve so-called equality, and of course you can never achieve equality, is by use of force, by use of coercion. So equality is wrong. It's a bad, bad, bad idea. One of the worst ideas in human history, in my view. Now, there is a sense in which equality is good, in which equality is just. It appears in the Declaration of Independence, and I think when the founders use it, they mean it in a different sense. And that is equality before the law. We all have the same rights. That is, it's equally true that you're not allowed to steal from me, and I'm not allowed to steal from you. And it doesn't matter if you're an aristocrat and I'm a peasant. Remember the context of the Declaration, right? We both murder, we should be treated the same as murderers. Equality before the law, equality before the state, equality of rights. We all have a right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the meaning, the correct meaning, in my view, of equality. Any other equality, of outcome, but including of opportunity. These are evil concepts that require, and I use evil purposefully because I view force as evil, because they require forcing some to sacrifice for others, some to become, in some way, the slaves of others. Just because of luck, just because they happen to be born talented, they get their stuff taken away to be given to other people who, for whatever reason, are untalented. Is that my phone? No, you look like you're going to go.
No.
Let me just quickly address the issue of justice, and it's funny, it's not funny, but it's common to put equality and justice together. But they're not the same thing. In our modern society, we attribute justice, equality to justice. Justice, in my view, I take justice in the sense of the way it used to be used. Getting what you deserve. In the marketplace, that's mean getting based on how productive you are, what your value is in the marketplace. In life, justice would suggest that if you're moral and you're a good person, you get a happy, successful life. Now, that doesn't always work out. Luck, accident do play a role. But generally, justice is about desert. They're not about equality.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, for 2 minutes. Yes, in form of a rebuttal, or if you want to add to, if you didn't feel that you finished what you wanted to say in the original form.
Okay, so I think that I can see from Dr. Brook talking that the key sort of difference here is sort of the value that we place on just raw human suffering. And so the notion that I would have is that sometimes people are born, to take their luck or because of unequal opportunity, and they're put in a situation where they're going to suffer for something they don't have the marketable talents, or it's very difficult for them to fund their education, or they're sick, or they're suffering of pollution, and that we can make a small trade-off to reduce human suffering, and that's not always bad. I think that's the key there. So I wouldn't advocate that we attempt to eliminate all human suffering, that we try to make everyone equal, that we break Michael Jordan's legs, that we go to any of those extremes, but that to reduce some human suffering, to reduce, especially in the most extreme cases, what we have to coercively take, and I'll concede that you do to do that, I think would be small in comparison to the suffering that we would relieve. And so the reason why taking from Michael Jordan a little bit of his income is not the same as breaking his legs is because if you broke his legs, the amount of suffering that you would do to him is immense. But if you took 10% or 20% of his income, the amount of suffering that he would endure is probably not immense. But you could use that to fund the reduction in suffering of children who are born without a good opportunity for education, or people who are born with diseases, and make their suffering go way down. And so that trade-off reduces the overall amount of human suffering, and that's a good. That's a good into itself. It's a world where there's less suffering. And I think that might be the core difference.
Thank you, Dr. Brook.
So I'll argue I'm not heartless. I do care about human suffering. But who gets to decide? Who gets to decide the value of Michael Jordan's legs versus 10% or 20%? Who gets to decide that X amount of suffering is worthy of coercing other people, but Y amount of suffering is not worthy of coercing other people? Where is this utility function that we can maximize? It doesn't exist, and it's immoral to do so. I believe that, yeah, if people are suffering and they ask for help, they're going to get help. We're benevolent. We don't want human beings to suffer. We're going to help them. And a society that's free of coercion is a benevolent, positive, healthy society in which people would help each other. But more than that, the amount of wealth being created would be astounding. And the number of people who truly were suffering to the extent that you would even consider coercing somebody else. I mean, the amount of people who really couldn't take care of themselves and the suffering would be so minute in such a society that charity could easily take care of that kind of suffering, that it would be a relatively irrelevant issue in a laissez-faire world. These so-called small trade-offs are how every government intervention starts, how every status policy starts. And I'm a big believer in slippery slopes. It's a slippery slope, and we slip down it very fast. Because, again, a little bit of suffering, but there's somebody over here that's suffering a little bit more and a little bit more. Look at how we got to that position today in America, where 50% of all the dollars spent on healthcare are spent by government. Right? It started with a small group of sufferers. Now it's almost everybody who receives government favor. So I think on principle it's wrong. In practice it doesn't work. Again, the principle here is leave it up. If people want to help other people, and I believe they do, make it voluntary. Don't make it coercive.
Thank you. The second question, this goes first to Dr. Brook. I think he was sort of hinting at this right at the end there. Both of these systems are effectively prospective. But what do your systems say about the status quo ex ante? Okay, let me put it this way. Do you care about how people accumulated property? Do you care about where people are at this moment in time? So both positions, for example, could be considered as rewarding sloth. The mixed economy, handing out money to someone who does not deserve it. The laissez-faire one saying, what does that say about trust fund benefits? Okay, both can be accused of rewarding immoral acquisition of property, of mediocrity. What does your system say about the status quo ex ante, which I think is a very important thing, and it first goes to Dr. Brook before, and then to Dr.
So let me see if I understand the question. So I would argue the status quo is, today is a mixture of clear injustice, where people have gotten money that they did not earn, they did not deserve. On the other hand, we live in a system that is not free, so people are oppressed because they can't rise up, because they can't let the entrepreneurial spirit really shine. We live in a world today where cronyism is prevalent, where people benefit enormously from, some people do, from lobbying government and having deals, insider deals with the government. You see it if you open the newspaper almost every day. Some people are being made rich by that, but other people, of course, are being made poor by the cronyism. Some businessmen benefit, some. All of that is true. The system we live today, which I think is a mixed economy, is an unjust economy. And it's immoral and it's wrong. The solution to it is to shift, is to start working aggressively towards more freedom, towards getting to the point where we have an economy that is based on moral principles, on the principles of freedom, of individual rights, of people pursuing their own life and their own happiness, free of this coercive element which is so prevalent in our society today. Now, what happens to trust fund babies in a laissez-faire economy? First of all, it's a small group. There are not that many super wealthy and children who can live off of trust funds. But so be it. So their life, let's say, I look at somebody, he's got a trust fund with $1 billion and they're wasting their life away. And I go, poor guy. They're the victim. They're suffering because they're withering their life away. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to be successful. They're not going to get self-esteem because they're just taking money out of the trust fund. And so they're the victims of their own. Again, it's justice. They're the victims. Money is not how we measure success in life. I know that's astounding for the guy who claims to be pro-capitalist, but it's not about money. It's about happiness. A lot of us make choices not to be wealthy, but to teach, because teaching is more fun, right? We make choices like that all the time. The trust fund baby has money, but if he doesn't work, if he doesn't excel at something, if he doesn't apply himself, he'll be miserable. So he'll suffer. So who cares? It's not anybody else's money. We can't say, well, society could do something good with that money. It's not society's money. It's the guy who made it and who's left it to this trust fund baby. So I don't see these problems of sloth in a free market. Are they going to be lazy people? Yeah, most lazy people won't make a lot of money. They won't be happy. They won't be successful. Within their lifetime, they will suffer the consequences of their laziness. People who work hard will hopefully gain the self-esteem and gain the happiness that is the reward for working hard and being successful in what you do. So again, I think the free market in this sense is a system of justice. It's a system of fairness. It's a system that spiritually rewards those who apply themselves, those who have the right virtues to be successful, and those who choose not to have those virtues are going to fail in life, and that's the only failure that really counts.
Okay,
Can I
thank you.
answer the question?
Dr. Smith.
Okay, so I think that the injustices of the past and the immoralities happened in the past is part of what we want to insure against. And so I do think that attempting to adjudicate all past disputes is problematic and leads to a long series of score settling that we probably want to avoid. But rather than just simply ignoring that and saying, well, whatever happened, happened, and, maybe you had a bad mistake, but that's just too bad. Part of what we want to do is say, well, look, there are unfortunate things about life. And one of the unfortunate things is perhaps you were born into an ethnic minority that had been persecuted. That's a common occurrence across the world. And that has affected your family, and that has affected your opportunity in life. And so what we can do is say that that's among the bad things that might happen to people that they had no control over, that we want to insure against and reduce the level of suffering associated with it. What I do kind of want to address in combining with Dr. Bruce's last comment, if I can, is the slippery slope concept. And the idea there's no halfway house between laissez-faire and perhaps a completely socialist or communist economy. That's the criticism that the mixed economy got from the beginning. That's the argument that people had. But since the 1930s, 1940s, when this argument first began, the United States and much of Western Europe, but especially in the United States, has maintained a mixed economy that has not simply descended into socialism. And so over time, we've had, for example, you talk about welfare kids, we've had a more expansive welfare system, a more inclusive welfare system that had intergenerational people on welfare generation after generation, and we moved to reform that system to reduce the prospect of intergenerational welfare. And so that's evidence right there that we can observe problems happening and abuses of the system, and then pull it back and say that we want to have a little bit less. We're doing too much. We're promoting too much sloth. We're promoting too. We're going too far in hurting incentives. We had extensive regulations in the 1970s that we pulled back on. That's acceptance that we ran into the knowledge problem, and we can pull back. And so the mixed economy as an equilibrium can exist. And it's not just a slippery slope on the way to a completely totalitarian state.
You know?
Okay.
I was caught off guard there. That's okay. No, that's good. We're keeping well within the time. Dr. Brook, you have 2 minutes if you want to use.
Sure. So let me make 2 points. One about this restitution of past suffering. Somebody over there is a racist. I'm not. Why do I get to suffer because they're a racist? Or my great-grandfather. My father was a racist, let's say. He's not, but let's say he was. Why is that my responsibility? And this goes to a deeper point related to the previous question. You know, I don't like the fact that people are suffering, but somebody else's suffering is not a claim against my life. Somebody else's suffering is not a moral claim against me. It's not a commandment that I must act. They're suffering. It might be sad, it might not be sad, depending on who they are and why they're suffering. I then, within the context of my life, need to decide if I'm going to do something about it or not. But there's a choice. Our life, you know, for me, the moral purpose of my life is not service to others. It's service to my happiness. It's attainment of my happiness, my human flourishing, to put it in Aristotelian terms. Just quickly with regard to the slippery slope. You know, just look at the Federal Register of Regulations. It goes like that. Now, yeah, we haven't achieved socialism, or declined into socialism, because that's a long slope. And we haven't gone to fascism, and there are bumps in the road, and you go up and down. But generally, if you look at government intervention into our lives in the economic sphere, it's different in other spheres, but clearly in the economic sphere, it has increased dramatically, and is increasing dramatically. And yes, there's short periods in which we deregulate, which we control. Even the welfare reform is, at least at the edges, being reversed now by the Obama administration because of the crisis we're in, and it'll be very difficult to reverse it back to the Clinton era. We'll see this over and over again. The general trend is still towards more and more statism, whether it's technically socialism or not. It's the growth of government is almost a constant.
Thank you. Dr. Smith?
Right, so I want to be clear that I do think that there's danger in getting deep into adjudicating past injustice and trying to hold Dr. Brooks accountable for something his father did, which is why it's helpful to recognize that these things do happen to people, and that in the same way that you are not responsible for the injustice of the past, the children today are suffering from them, and the people in the past, we're not responsible either. And what we have to make as a choice as individuals is not only what are we going to do for our lives, but what policies are we going to support, right? And so if we support the policy of doing nothing, that's a policy that we have chosen, and the consequences of it we have to accept. And so if we're saying we're choosing to do nothing, then we're saying we are choosing that children who are born into lower income circumstances because of things that they didn't control, or because of past immoral injustice, or even because of just bad luck, or because their parents were just not good at being parents, that we're going to allow them to simply sit there and suffer. That's a choice that we're making through our policy instruments. And so we have that, we don't lose moral responsibility for that simply because Dr. Brooks feels that only his flourishing is the concern. We still have more responsibility for all the choices that we make, including the choices of whether we're going to support this government policy or not.
Okay, thank you. Third question, and this goes to Dr. Smith first for the first 4 minutes. Third and final question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions, and we'll rid ourselves of the shackles of the debate format. We've talked you two, I haven't said very much, but you've talked a great deal about theory, these things in theory. But what about some empirics here? Can you provide an example or two in a real time, in a real place, where your view was implemented and provided what most people would reasonably consider satisfactory results?
Okay.
Dr. Smith, yeah.
Yes. So the transition from what was a much more laissez-faire economy in the late 19th and early 20th century to a more mixed economy in the United States, with the advent of Social Security in particular, was an advance that lots of people felt good about, felt happy about, felt contributed to their lives. Surveys today, people who paid in and took out, that they enjoyed Social Security. The reforms that took place in the middle of the 19th century in England to support some relief for war people were popular at the time and remain popular through today. I think if we just try to look in real time, we've seen an expansion in public education, or at least public funding for education, that has appeared to produce large gains in educational attainment, has appeared to produce large gains in human capital, contribute to the growth of the economy, is widely supported by most people, and even today, if there's a dispute over whether or not government should produce education, the government funding of education seems to have been a widely successful process. And so those are some real times where government has stepped in and provided some service to manage for some contract that couldn't be written, some externality that existed. So, and again, we can look at the series acid rain controls we had in the Northeast corridor were seemed to be widely successful, came in at a fairly low cost, seemed to improve the lives of everyone in the Northeast corridor. And these are sort of just off the top of my head examples of times that we've expanded the role of government to take care of some of these particular problems, and people have been satisfied with the results.
Okay, Dr. Brook.
So, let me start by saying that probably other in this room than the people in this room, my position is not going to be the popular one, so people are not happy with my position. We'll start with that. Obviously, they are happy with the status quo because they keep voting for it, and that is the majority will. The majority will is to keep the mixed economy and grow the coercive portion of the mixed economy gets better to the big portion of it. I started by saying there'd be no pure examples of laissez-faire capitalism. They haven't been, not in its true pure form. Even in the U.S. in the first half of the 19th century had slavery, obviously not a laissez-faire policy. But even in the portions where there wasn't slavery, states and local governments intervened and invited reform. Banking was never free in the United States, not fully free. But states and local governments and the federal government were intervening in the finances and banking from the beginning, created a big mess of the whole thing. But which was still suffering because they were policies of the 19th century still affect us today. The state intervention back then still affect us today. If you want to know how. But let me give you two examples where we came closest. One would be the U.S. in the 19th century, and in spite of all of that, we went from being a European colony under the Brits in 1776. I mean, we won the war, let's be honest, because they, we wouldn't have put to, and they had bigger fish to fry elsewhere. To becoming the world's mightiest industrial power by far, by the Great World War I. So in the span of 140 years, the United States went from, a mediocre colony to a world empire from the perspective of wealth creation, from the perspective of industry, from the perspective spectral production. That happened in, for the most part, not completely, a laissez-faire environment, and I doubt if that would happen in a mixed economy. Growth rates have declined since then, since exactly 100 years of the Federal Reserve and income tax, both passed in 1913. Growth rates during that 19th century period are unprecedented in human history in terms of the increase in standard of living, particularly given where you started, and particularly given the massive immigration that this country has absorbed. Again, unprecedented in human history. There were so many people into a territory all at once, and yet, the success of those generations, the success of those immigrants is astounding. The second example I would use, again, it's not a pure, it's more on the side of capitalism and more laissez-faire, is Hong Kong. Hong Kong 70 years ago was a little fishing village in the middle of nowhere on a rock. Almost nobody lived there. Today, 7.5 million people live on this rock. It's a pretty amazing place. If you've never been there, I encourage everybody once in their life to go visit Hong Kong. It puts New York to shame in terms of the skyscrapers. It's an energized place where per capita GDP, which is a measure of wealth, is the same as the United States. And they've done it very quickly, very short span, because of the freedom they've been allowed. I would question all the benefits that have been attributed to the mixed economy. Certainly public education, I would question the benefit it has had, and Social Security certainly. I think Social Security is a dead cost on this economy for individuals, from the perspective of the individuals. I think the mixed economy lowers our standard of living, makes it harder for us to advance, and again, if we lose something more precious than money, we lose freedom when we mix coercion and freedom.
Good, thank you. 2 minutes?
So I think we want to be careful when we look at the 19th century. I think that is a great example in the United States. We did have enormously robust growth, though just arguing that coming from a unindustrialized nation, industrializing rapidly proves the benefit of laissez-faire, ignores the phenomenon of catch-up growth. And our easiest example of that, so we don't get too upset, is China. Right? So China is far from a laissez-faire paradise right now, and it's enjoying incredibly rapid growth because they have opened up some elements of a market economy, and then they have catch-up growth that pushes them towards the technological frontier. And so as long as you have a basically market economy, you will catch up to the frontier, and we've seen that in China, we've seen that in Japan, we've seen that in Korea, we've seen that in the United States during the 19th century. But if we look at human happiness, as Dr. Brook says is key here, most people look at the reforms that happened from the 19th century to the early 20th century as having positively affected their lives. I mean, we look at public education, and we talk about that a lot because it's one of the largest things that the state actually does, is fund public education. And most people feel this has a positive impact on their lives and their children's lives and their ability to reach their potential. We look at Social Security, another very large thing that the state does. And most participants in the program seem to enjoy it. And that's our criteria. Is this program making people happier, making them happier or unhappy? It's going to be saying that, telling us that it's making them happy. And so these programs, which represent the largest expansions of the state, have made people happy. Medicare, which is in flux, even today, most people are happy about participating in the program with Medicare. And so we see that these large programs tend to produce more people saying that they make them happy than less money.
Thank you. That was perfect, 2 minutes. So I don't think you can apply catch-up growth to the U.S. in the 19th century. There was no need to catch up to. We were making it up as we went along. It is a completely different phenomenon than the phenomenon of China today, which benefits enormously from the human capital we in the West developed during the 19th century, for the technology that we in the West developed during the 19th century, from the capital, just the money, the infrastructure, the machinery that we can just send across it, and instantaneously they can build hardware. America, Western Europe during the 19th century, had made this all up. There was no capital. There was no knowledge base. There was no financial capital. I mean, there was no wealth. The wealth had to literally be created. So the phenomenon, very different phenomenon between the two. And yes, I think it was very fast to a large extent because of all the capital we accumulated, we can help them grow faster. One of the major things China did was open up its economy to foreigners. Happiness. Generally, I don't trust happiness studies. I don't know how, people's assessment of their own happiness is a pretty fuzzy thing, which is hard to put their arms around. But yeah, people are happy about Social Security because they don't think about the alternative. The alternative would have been to put the money into a saving account and have at the end of the day more money than they would under Social Security. What Social Security does is it rewards people who wouldn't have saved, which is a minority. Most people are responsible, they would have saved. But people don't think that way. If they do the math, like I'm a finance guy, so I do the math, they would realize that they've been screwed, that they made less money. And what they're doing is this coercion, all it does is it subsidizes irresponsibility and harms responsibility. It subsidizes the people who wouldn't save and harms the people who would have saved.
Well, thank you very much to both panelists. This is where
No, they're going to line up along the middle, and Katie's going to hold the mic up.
Have a question.
It'll be both lines there.
But if you feel there have been 2 or 3 questions to one of the panelists and the other panelists haven't really had a shot, please ask the question to the other one so that we can have some balance here. And I think that's of value to everyone. So, first person, want to ask a question?
Is the mic on?
Yeah. And I might repeat the question because I think for the purposes of the video, the web stream, I've been asked to do that. So I will. Yeah, well, so I'll
stay behind this row.
Back there, so the audience really needs to know what the question is. And I'll just say the question basically is, what is the essence of a mixed economy? What is the essence of a laissez-faire capitalist? And I'm not a society, and I'm not sure if you wanted this in the question, to try to engage each other as well. So if you state what your essence is, and then maybe say, okay, the essence of the other guy is this, I'll try to engage that a little bit. Is that a good way of summarizing the question? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go first. So I think that's right. And finding a single moral principle is difficult, but I think that the alleviation of human suffering as a good unto itself is probably the closest thing that you can come and say is a foundational principle of the mixed economy. And as I see the difference of Dr. Brooks and a sort of more completely laissez-faire system is the idea that any incursion on human freedom is unjust, no matter what the reason or no matter what the supposed benefit. Does Am I correct? So that counter proposes against the idea that the alleviation of suffering, human suffering, is itself a good or a bad.
Yeah, so the fundamental principle here would be that system which allows human beings to make choices that lead to their own individual flourishing. So it is an individualistic focus. It is about you as an individual and what system. And I believe that what you need in order to achieve human flourishing, I think human flourishing is attained when you are free to exercise your mind. Our reason is our capacity to survive, but it's our capacity to flourish. And I think there's one enemy of reason. The number one enemy of individual human reason is force. When I put a gun to your back and say, from now on, 2 + 2 = 5, that's it. You can't think. You can't build a bridge. You can't program a computer. You can't do anything. Because otherwise you're dead, right? Because if you succeed, 2 + 2 = 4, and you're shot. So I want a society which leaves people free to engage their mind, engage their reason, to pursue their values that they believe will lead to their success. And therefore, I want a society that extracts that force, that prohibits people from putting a gun to their back. I don't want to, and human suffering, if it exists, it exists. You know, there's lots of human suffering today in the world that I don't think about. I don't, I mean, I'll admit it, right? People are suffering in Cambodia, people are certainly suffering in North Korea. I don't think about it. You know, my life is my life, and that's my focus. The focus is, how do I attain my values? And again, I think the way to do that, in a social context, I have to do a lot with myself, but in a social context, what I want is to be free from people forcing me to live life differently than I believe I should.
I think they did a pretty good job of engaging the other one on their own terms. Next question.
So yesterday I took a trip to Kansas, and I had this magic machine, right? I put 1 point in, and it gave me 2 points out. And I realized, you know, such a machine existed, you know, I didn't know whatever I want, right? Well, I thought about it, and I thought about the fact that for the past 10 years, somewhere between a third and a half of all federal expenditures have been financed by debt, not by taxation. And I realized the government for 10 years at least has been a machine where people put some money in and the government gives them more money back. The problem is you can't keep doing that, it's not sustainable. Eventually you end up at Greece, you end up at Ireland, you end up at Spain is better. And so my question with regard to mixed economy is, why do governments always seem to sell programs that are unsustainable? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid have been brought up. They're popular with 60 to 70% of the population. But it seems like they would be if they're paying out more than they're taking in. At some point, they're going to be taking in more than they're paying out, and maybe they won't be so popular. And so, for the advocate for the mixed economy, I'm interested in understanding why it is that almost all governments all over the world are in debt right now, and why they always seem to do that all the time.
Okay, I guess the question is, mixed economy leads to government debt, and the assumption is that that is normatively bad. Right. I guess in the question, the way I understand it.
And so, I mean, I think the issue of debt finance is complex, and it's kind of what I spend my life thinking about. But the short answer to that is twofold. Number one is that a large portion of government services are funded by state and local governments, which for the most part don't go into debt. And so you have governments that are supported by the people and don't go into debt, and people like the idea of public education that's mainly done by state and local governments. And so I don't think it's inevitable. At the national level, you do see governments often going into debt, and the reason that they do that is typically because their borrowing costs are so low. And so, the United States is a great example. The U.S. government has enormous amounts of debt, but the U.S. government borrows at an extremely low interest rate. So essentially, a short-term debt for the U.S. government, they can borrow at 0%. And that's a very attractive trade-off to make, to say that we can finance a program now, and we will pay no interest on pushing it forward into the future. Most companies will take that if offer was given to them. Most households will take the offer given to them. The U.S. government is one of the few institutions to whom it is offered because of its political stability and the fact that over its history it has never missed a debt.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I don't think that's the reason they take on the debt. The reason they take on debt is easy. It's easy, right? You spend it now, and you're going to tax people who are not voting right now. And, it's easy for grandmothers to collect a lot of money, and they don't think that their grandkids are going to have to pay for it. And when you tell them, they're actually quite shocked about it, but it's easier to shift the burden into the future to generations that don't vote. If we had to tax all government expenditures right now, we would rebel in the ballot booth. But it's our kids, it's our grandkids, who cares, right? It's in the future, somehow it'll all be whitewashed. And let me just say, the reason the government can raise debt right now at 0% is because it's selling the bonds to itself. It's printing the money. The Federal Reserve right now is buying 75% of all the debt issued by the federal government. That's cheating, right? And it's cheating. There's a cost to the cheating. What that cost is, we'll find out in the years to come. But it's some form of inflation, whether it's a bubble or prices go up or something. But they really are right now printing the money. That's all they're doing. When the Federal Reserve buys the debt from the government, all it is running the presses. It's not a market that's determining the debt, the interest at zero right now. If the Fed got out, this is why they're printing the money. If the Fed got out of bond buying, interest rates would go up. That's why they're not getting out of it, because they want interest rates to be low.
Yes, next question.
Yes, this question is for both speakers to address it. It's mostly from what the doctor said. Has to do with the idea of coercion and principles. So I think there's three parts to this. One, am I right in thinking that you think it's okay to use coercion in some cases? In this case, the alleviation of suffering. So I use coercion and all, don't initiate force. Let's just get off someone else with suffering. I think I got this right. Actually, you can address your clarity on it. Sounds like you're already got it. So my question is, what are your positions on this? Can principles be violated? And what are the conditions? What are your positions on principles and such? Can it be violated? Is it okay to use, for example, initiate force against people when normally you don't, because that's what's in the regime? The other thing is, kind of third part of this. I guess we could start with that. With all that it's okay to initiate force against your neighbor.
Well, why don't we broaden the question, which was sort of the second part I think you were talking about, which is to address it to both panelists and say, are there circumstances under which your cherished principles may be adaptable? Let's put it that way. Perhaps you can think of a situation or two when that's the case. My sense is it's probably going to be a little bit easier for Professor Smith, since by definition this is a sort of pragmatic approach. But so why don't we let him go first? So then we can.
Yeah. So off the top of my head, one of the reasons why I try to focus on the alleviation of human suffering and making that a criterion for whether or not we justify some sort of coercive action is that reduces the amount of cases where we think we would have to make across that principle, right? It puts out of reach some things that we might like to do that we wouldn't otherwise do, but it reduces that. So off the top of my head, I can't think of a case. I wouldn't be inflexible about it. I wouldn't say that this is that we have found, the absolute moral rock principle, and this is it. Because I just don't think that moral philosophy is finished, and the project of moral philosophy is finished. But as a general rule, if we stick to saying, are we alleviating human suffering? Do we see a case where there are children or other people who are suffering and we can make them better before we initiate coercion, then we're fairly safe. And people do live their lives that way. So I think most people don't say, even if I see someone, beating up another person or, putting a person in a horrible situation, I can't initiate any force to stop that. Like, I can only defend myself. Right? Most people do think that there are cases in which they could impose upon another person, make demands, perhaps even start a fight to alleviate some suffering that they saw going on. Even in people's common lives, I think they do believe that. So,
Yeah. Okay. Quick.
The last part of this question, in fact, initiating force doesn't benefit the suffering. Oh, yeah, that's why.
That's precisely why I think sticking with suffering and not thinking so. Well, here are all these gains beyond this that we could achieve if only we could make people do the right thing. Is because you know that when you threaten people with the use of force, and hopefully you don't have to use it. So hopefully you don't have a system where you're imposing coercion upon people, but it's always backed by coercion. That's what makes the government the government. Is that you know that that has a potential to create suffering, and so you want to be able to say, well, we're alleviating more suffering here, right? And then you can look at examples. So if you look at something like, forcing children to go to school, which is something that we do, so you have to go to school for a certain age, right? And we can easily say, so how many times do we actually have to go into a home and rip a child from their parents' arms and force them into the classroom, versus how much do we see the lives of those children, the suffering of those children improve over cases in, we don't now have to compare to third world countries, but cases in India where they don't have universal public education and the children don't have these opportunities. So that gives us a sort of a raw comparison that we do. And the fact that we don't very often have to go into people's homes and force their children to go to school lets us know that we're probably to the good on this one. We're probably well.
Yeah, so I reject completely the whole utilitarian calculus, the whole idea that we can balance out force and we can balance out benefits and costs and do this calculation. So, I believe that to be an immoral standard for human action and human behavior. I don't think it's doable. I think we pretend that we can do it. We pretend that we know how much suffering we've alleviated at what cost, but we have no clue. We don't have the tools to measure it, and there's no way to measure it because it's about the human psyche. So I reject that whole way of looking at morality and at life. This is about your personal morality, and I think it's wrong to steal. Always wrong to steal. Whether it's stealing because we voted to steal, or whether it's stealing when you pull a gun in the street, it's the same thing. Taking my money by force against my will is always, always wrong, no matter who benefits. If somebody benefits, then let them make the argument to me, and I might help them. But to take it from me by force is always wrong. So I said, now you could concord a lifeboat scenario in which the principles are, but lifeboat scenarios by definition are not about life. They're about lifeboats, and morality generally I don't think applies in lifeboat scenarios, which is, by the way, the opposite of the way morality is taught at the university. It's taught as if everything's a lifeboat, and you develop morality on a lifeboat, and then you apply it to life, which I think is complete nonsense. Morality is about living, it's about day-to-day life, it's about the choices you make every single day. Just a quick point on initiation of force, because I want to make clear that we're clear. If I see somebody beating somebody else up, that person has initiated force, and I would completely within my right to go and stop him from beating that other person up. I'm not initiating force on him. It's the initiator of force which is in the wrong. And yeah, of course it's appropriate for you to, if you see some guy, stealing from a house or doing something, and call the police or do it yourself. But he's the crook, he's the enemy. That's the initiation of force. That's the beginning. And the last point on human suffering, I don't want to come across as completely indifferent to human suffering, although I guess I said I was indifferent. I believe that laissez-faire capitalism is the system that reduces human suffering the most. But that's not why I support it. That's an outcome. I support it for the other reason. I think history has shown that, we were far more into suffering, human suffering was the common state of life. What did Hobbes say? Life was short. Nasty, Brutish, and short. And it was. And it's capitalism that saved us from the Hobbesian universe of that kind of life.
Thank you. Next question.
So about music, what is something now you improve in your care approach? For example, how can the education system or activity improve health care? And then the full-on idea of the group with government help and maybe
Okay, and the question effectively is how, name something that is current state of affairs that would be improved in a sort of normative sense, I guess, and also would be widely accepted by most people as being improved by your system.
So widely accepted, it's a challenge.
So everything, right?
Yeah, so everything.
Yeah.
But everything that the government intervenes in today, could be improved, and the government could actually have the energy to actually focus on the thing it's supposed to do, which it doesn't do very well, because it's so focused on all the garbage that it should be doing. So they can't catch Bernie Madoff because they're monitoring my 13D filings, right? Because I might do something, but they can't catch the bad guys. But let me take one that's controversial, just for the hell of it, right? Education, public, because it's been mentioned a lot, which is public education. Wow. I mean, there's a lot of room for improvement. I'd love to see private education completely privatized. Completely 100% privatized. I'd love to see competition and innovation and the energy and the brain power that goes into profit-seeking activities. I'd like to see that apply to education. I think it's unimaginable to us today how good education should become. Instead of every entrepreneur thinking, how can I make a better app for this thing, which marginally makes our lives better, imagine if those entrepreneurs were going into education and trying to build a better school, trying to create a better curriculum, and it's happening a little bit online, but imagine if all those resources were really being applied and there was money to be made at it, there was fun to be had doing it, and you had the creative juices of the entrepreneurial spirit of America applied to the educational project. Wow, I mean, that would be exciting.
Dr. Smith?
So I have a pretty strong, bar to cross. So I don't have a long list of things that I actually think that the government should expand in, but two that I would say that we probably could work in is this. One are tradable pollution permits for carbon dioxide. That would allow us to mitigate some of the harmful effects of climate change through, ultimately through a market system, but through a market system that the government would have to have a role in creating. And the other is probably lead removal and the removal of old lead paint under windows. That's a case where children, I think, are still being affected by exposure to lead poisoning, and we do see parents either not choosing or not having the knowledge or not funding the removal of the lead from those windows, and the children themselves not being able to enter the market and do it. And so I think the government entering in and removing lead paint from windows in inner cities would be a positive improvement.
How many people have we got there? Okay, all right. So let's stop there. Don't join the line now. Okay, so we can get through the questions pretty quickly. Yes, sir.
My name is William, and I consider myself a free marketer. There's a good portion of free marketers that I actually call followers and views on this. My question was, first, we live in a world where we pretty much go to the adjustment to the idea that only the state should have the right to compel that only the state should create a right to survive. That is the general assumption that the world has created. However, in recent years, digital currency, privatized currency, such as Bitcoin, where they start to prove themselves as a valid currency where it's controlled by private individuals and controlled not by the state, but by a few people trading it privately, so that's what we define our market. So my question for you is, how do you view currency? Should it always be state-funded, or is there room sometimes to replace it with a stable and competing monetary monetary currencies?
Yeah. What about those private currencies or other entities being able to issue currency in this country rather than, say, just the federal government?
So, so I'm a proponent of. I think it's a travesty that the government prints money. I think that the Federal Reserve has done a huge amount of harm to the U.S. economy, and it's just got private banking. I don't think you'd have competing currencies for very long. I think good money will drive out bad money. The opposite of Gresham's law, and that you would probably stabilize over somebody like gold or something like that. But I think it should be private. I think the market should decide on the currency. And I think you would have a far more stable, healthier economy, from a purely economic perspective, under a free banking gold standard or whatever the currency happened to be, than you do with the Federal Reserve. I think the Federal Reserve has proved to be an unbelievably disastrous experiment over the last exactly 100 years. And there are a series of papers now being published in academia showing this, the increased volatility, the increased uncertainty, the depreciation of the value of the dollar, and the creation of some of the greatest economic crises that a free society has seen.
Dr. Smith.
So I'm okay with the creation of Bitcoin, and I think that in general we should allow those types of experiments to go forward. I do think that at least right now, until some other currency proves itself, that the idea that you pay taxes in dollars and then you settle judicial torts in dollars and you pay damages in dollars is a fine standard. We are required to do that. You have to have dollars to pay taxes, you have to have dollars to pay torts, you have to have dollars to pay equity damages. That equity.
Next question, Kurt.
Hey, Dr. Brook, how's it going? So my question is this kind of situation. So I have this contract with a government, and every Thursday what happens is I gather some ingredients from the local grocery store, and I go to the box and make milk lunch. And it's kind of a free lunch, it doesn't make a call down, it doesn't call other things. But this is kind of a national choice. Part of my contract states that if I don't make this lunch for Bill, he's going to break my rights. So my question to you, Dr. Brook, is in situations like that, there's private coercion okay? Can I consent to coercion? Is that moral? Is that a moral goal? Is that a claim in your system of capitalism?
No, you can't. It's an interesting question. So I haven't had that question before, so I need to think about it for a second. But no. Breaking of legs, you know, this is something that Shakespeare deals with in The Merchant of Venice. You remember, the guy can't pay back the loan, and the contract says he has to extract a pound of flesh for that. I think that it is legitimate to say that in commercial transactions, that the government will uphold contracts that are denominated in a currency, but that are not denominated in flesh, which is breaking bones. And I think, and I haven't thought it through exactly, the exact sequence, but I think that government would only protect contracts that were denominated in dollars, whatever the standard of monetary unit was at the time, and would not protect contracts that had to do with breaking of legs.
Did you want to say anything?
No? In a mixed
Next question, please.
Yeah, thank you guys both so much for taking that up. My question, someone went through right, but following outside, so we're going to get quickly. My question to you is sort of a moral standpoint from which music I don't know social standpoint, but I personally find interesting. And it's not perfect talking about the idea that if people have things involved and they have the freedom to spend it as they wanted to, that they would give charity, they would give to, say, people who could afford education, people who could afford healthcare, they would do so during this doing so if they wanted to. The premise of socialism or next more market economy is the idea of saying if the government doesn't force them to do it, they won't. And so my answer to that is not a misconception. It is the idea that Congress and that people will get charity, that they will see that out of the is it just a problem to say that they won't have to?
I guess it's an empirical question, really. I mean, there are presumably a number of quasi-experimental situations where people have tested that, I would think. So the question is, if public policy was moved in a more laissez-faire direction, would people do what Dr. Brook said, which is continue with their philanthropic behaviour, or would, as people who believe that perhaps the state needs to reinforce this behaviour, would they stop them? Right? That's a
basically, yeah.
We'll also be funded through charity. So it's difficult to have pure experiments on this. I think the basic evidence that we have is that especially services like public education weren't and aren't funded throughout the world purely through charity. There are many charities who do great work in that area, but it's chronically underfunded in places where there's not public support. And the intellectual idea, the theoretical idea, is that there's essentially a free rider problem, which is that what you want is for there not to be, children in the streets who have nowhere to go and no, education and stuff. And you would pay for it if you had to, but you'd really rather somebody else, right? And so every time someone gives to charity, right, you have the ability to sort of free ride on their charity because they're reducing some of the problem for you. And that leads to an underproduction of charitable services because you want a free ride on the other guy who's providing instead of paying for it yourself. But people would consent to saying, all right, we'll all agree that everyone's going to put in on this together, and no one gets the free ride. So that's how you get a situation where people might all agree to do this thing under coercion, but if left to their own devices, they would each try to push it off onto the other, each try to free ride on the other's networks.
Yeah, let me just say, they can't all agree under coercion. By definition, if it's under coercion, some people are not agreeing. So some people are being forced, they're being coerced, so they haven't all agreed.
But you could vote unanimously for a coercive policy. I mean, that's something that candidate. You could vote unanimously for a coercive policy.
Yes, but it wouldn't be coercive as long as everybody agreed. So, but if there was one person who disagreed, he would be coerced into participating, and it wouldn't be unanimous anymore. And democracy leads to that, right? Because we don't require unanimity; we require majorities, and 51% is enough of a majority to coerce 49% into doing stuff they don't want to do. But yeah, if your standard is the amount of redistribution of wealth that's happening today, no, there would never be a charitable urge that would lead to that. I mean, but you don't need it. My argument would be that the reason we need so much redistribution today to alleviate suffering is because we're not free. That under freedom, wealth increases. Under freedom, there are fewer people who need help, significantly fewer people who need help, and then the standard for who you give help and who you don't is different. You don't give help to everybody in a kind of a blind, in a blind set. You try to make the help to those who deserve help. Some people deserve help, some people don't. But the experiment, I think the best experiment for this was 19th century US, where there was a lot of charity. Again, not by the standards of today, but a lot of charity, and where most people didn't need charity, but there were also innovations. There were market innovations. There were mutual aid societies, which were kind of voluntary associations where people joined, to help each other. There was also things like poverty insurance. You could buy insurance against bad stuff happening to you and you falling into poverty. So private markets developed, to compensate that. Of course, once the state enters these markets, all of that stuff disappears because it prices them, it crowds them out. We see that in industry after industry. So real charity, that kind of charity, but these other kind of voluntary associations were all crowded out by the entrance of government into this. And it happened before the Great Depression. It happened on the state level, even in the late 19th century, certainly in the early 20s. Thank you.
I apologize, I think I have a answer question directly to you. I think it's quite different as I follow. But the strategy I know the philosophy that there is a very good place. If children may have their lives better choice, they can't make the choice for themselves. Where do you realistically have where do people fall with this decision?
Yeah. So I believe that children, in a sense, when they're born, are delegating the application of their rights to their parents. I mean, their parents are their representatives, or their agents in upholding the child's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, a child can't make a decision about education. He can't take out a loan. He can't do any of those things, and it's up to the parent to do it. I think an overwhelming majority of children are born to parents that want to do the best thing for their children. And will do the best thing for their children, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the other things. And if they have to take out loans themselves in order to clothe and feed and educate their kids, they will do that. And they have historically done it. There is going to be a minority of children who are born because of bad luck or whatever, however you want to call it, to parents who don't. And yet who don't abuse them either, who kind of just, you know, the kids are just there. And that's, you know, they're not hurting them physically, which would stimulate a response, in my view, from the government. The government would have to intervene. It's child abuse, take the child away from parents in those cases. So they're not doing that, but they're also not doing the kind of things that we think are necessary, you know, for the child to flourish. And my response to that would be, it's sad. But it doesn't justify coercion. It doesn't justify forcing somebody else to provide that for the children. It's sad, it's unpleasant. If charities can intervene, they should. If private agencies of social workers can intervene, they should. But it's no excuse to force somebody else. Again, somebody else's suffering, somebody else's bad luck, somebody else's whatever is not a claim against my life. It's certainly not a claim to use coercion against my life.
We've got, how many people do we have? 4? Okay.
Sneaking back.
Yeah, they are. I thought we ended the line, but it seems to. Let's do these pretty quickly then. Yes.
Short questions and one question.
What changes do we need to do to reduce the amount of suffering that governments cause? Like three examples of suffering that government causes.
How do you reduce the suffering governments cause?
So if we're just talking about policies that I support, I think that a much higher standard to the use of international military force would be step one. I think probably a reduction in the punishment of nonviolent crimes would be another step. So drug offenses. Those would be the immediate types of things that I see government doing, causing people suffering on a daily basis. I actually think that the Federal Reserve is not aggressive enough in stimulating economic growth, so promote a more aggressive quantitative easing policy. Those are probably the 3 right at the top. And
I think I need to clarify my question, but I was talking more specifically about things like killing, stealing, terrorizing, collaboration, kidnapping, torturing, things like that.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a list.
To reduce the suffering the government is causing people in most respects.
So I'm not if you're asking for what laws I would write, I'm not an expert on international policy in that way.
I think you already asked it, for example, with responses to drug laws. That was
as a general method.
That was consistent with the answer that you're looking for, I think.
Yeah.
Not imprisoning people who smoke marijuana, for example. Right. That he said that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that Dr. Brooks got literally thousands of these.
Yeah, and the drug issue, I would say all of them are victimless crimes. Drugs should be legal. And people who commit so-called victimless crimes should be all free from jail. That would reduce suffering.
Thank you. Next question.
I have a question for Dr. Brook. I understand that the basis of the life support system is the idea that we're free. I have actually mentioned so why should I understand everybody else's life position? Because life forces you to find still be why should I ask this? The quality focus. What's my motivation?
Okay, good question. This is a deep question as to, I guess, where does my freedom end and someone else's begin? Would be perhaps one way of putting it, yeah.
There is no meaning to the concept of freedom if you are free to coerce other people. So you can't be free. It's meaningless to say I'm free and I'm going to enslave other people. You've created a system in which you've allowed enslavement and you're going to be next. That's not the system I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for a system of government, and I'm not an anarchist. I believe in government, where government protects us from, maybe you chose, maybe you decided it would be good for me to steal from other people. No, there's a government there to protect other people from your coercion. Now, I believe that morality, your question, I guess, was about morality, that morally, it is never in your interest, and I don't have time in 2 minutes to prove this, never in your interest to lie, cheat, steal, and coerce other people. That it never benefits your life to actually go out there and exploit other people. So I believe in self-interest, the self-interest that says that you should not sacrifice yourself for other people, nor have other people sacrifice for you. Now, why is that true? You know, read Ayn Rand, read my book. But it's because of where we gain human happiness, what human happiness requires, what success as a human being, what flourishing as a human being requires. It requires self-esteem, it requires honesty and justice, and a lot of these other concepts. It fundamentally requires reason, and you can't reason yourself to coerce other people.
Quickly.
Well, just in response to that, what is the example of NC State? Because under my government, which supports the people, and I feel pretty happy going with that. A lot of other people too, you know, trying to think of you this
No, I don't think you going there is wrong. This is the system you're in. Not going to NC State would be ridiculous. Not driving on the roads because they coerced funding, we paid for those roads, would be ridiculous. The fact is we live in a particular system, make the most of that system. I would only argue to you that in the big picture, if NC State was a private institution, but that the world was private, not just NC State, but the world was truly laissez-faire capitalism, NC State would be a better experience. It wouldn't be called NC State, but whatever it was called, it would be a better experience. Your life after graduation would be better. Your life before graduation would have been better, and your educational experience would be more rewarding. I can't prove that. There's no alternative university spinning around with laissez-faire capitalism on it. But that is my argument. Not that you're not enjoying yourself. Now, I'm having a great time living my life, in spite of the fact that we have a mixed economy. I just think I'd have an even better life if laissez-faire capitalism was.
Good answer, since you're here at NC State. Okay. Second to last question. Yeah, good. So people require information to make decisions. How is your system provide them with sufficient information so that they can make these wise decisions? Dr. Smith.
So we can start. So I think that the mixed economy doesn't presume that there's complete information among individuals. One of the sources of suffering that emerges. We do have a couple of other problems and issues. So one of the things we try to do is promote education because that does expand information and allow people to make better decisions. The other thing is to recognize that because there's not perfect information among citizenry, there's going to be even less perfect information among government policymakers, and to be constrained in sort of the policies that you're willing to adopt. And so that is an important part of being mixed and not falling down the slippery slope towards socialism, is to be constrained, and is to say that we are humble in trying to do what we do, and we want to be sure, or at least be as confident as we can be, that we are alleviating suffering and not expanding.
So let me just say, free markets, my position is to not assume that people have somehow endowed in them perfect and complete information. They don't. That's a wonderful profit opportunity for somebody to come in and help provide me with the information that I need. Information is a tradable good. It is something that there's a profit motive to be provided. You can see this in financial markets. There are a lot of private entities that come about to try to provide information. They compete with one another. And when we try to constrain that competition, as government always does, we get lousy information because there's no consequences to failure. Think rating agencies, only 3, all government approved, all government, you have to use them, you have no choice, there's no competition. You get lousy information. When government intervenes, it distorts the information. For example, there's a story right now about the federal government wants to make sure that kids eat healthy food in cafeterias at school. We all want kids to eat healthy food in cafeterias. But who's to say what healthy food is? Now, do we trust the government? Now, what are the incentives that the government, look at the food pyramid. You know how they determine the food pyramid? Well, the corn lobby comes in and advocates for corn. And the meat lobby comes in and advocates for meat, and the milk lobby comes in and advocates for milk. There's no science that goes into this. It's pressure groups. That's how government functions. Government functions by pressure groups. And it's a consensus. It's some kind of middle of the road. Instead of letting parents and maybe scientists and maybe people who actually know something about nutrition make these decisions. And I'm not saying this particular decision by the education department is wrong, because education's a mess, so, you know. But in a private educational system, you'd get the filtered information. The marketplace would filter it. The marketplace would filter it based on our values, based on our consumer values. So I'm never going to be able to guarantee that everybody has perfect and complete information. I don't think that's the right standard. But I think that the free market provides more and significantly better information than does a mixed economy.
And our last question.
What a good.
Hi, my question is mainly directed to Dr. Brooks, but in a very kind of extremely hypothetical situation to support that, and not how we propose to run an army under a purely capitalist economy.
That's interesting. So the question is, do you agree with the military draft? And if not, then how are you going to raise an army when needed to do so under a purely capitalist economy?
It's a good question. It's a personal question, because I was actually drafted. I was enlisted in the Israeli army when I was 18, and everybody in Israel is enlisted. I am against the draft under all circumstances, in spite of that experience. Or maybe because of it. No, in spite of it. I believe that, let me put it succinctly, a country that cannot raise a voluntary army necessary to defend itself doesn't deserve to exist.
You caught me unaware. Yeah, sorry.
So the short answer is that the draft is one of the hardest choices that you have to make, and the choice that we should be the most humble about, but I wouldn't rule it out. And so the obvious problem, the obvious example we had is what to do about a situation like Nazism. And you have to take that problem very seriously, and you want to be very, very hesitant to engage, but there are times when you might even have to say that the actual security of the United States may not even indeed be threatened by Nazi Germany. But nonetheless, there is human suffering that we can alleviate, and arranging a draft will do that. And we understand the horribleness associated with the draft and forcing young boys to go to war. But we do the best we can to weigh the two ends of the suffering spectrum between allowing Nazism to expand and drafting conditions beyond.
So this is good, because I think we'll get a final contrast if we will. If Nazism was not a threat to the United States, I mean, imagine a scenario like that. That's hard, because they clearly are threatening the United States. The United States, in my view, should not go to war with the Nazis. That is, going to war to protect the suffering of people far away is not a legitimate reason for the United States to go to war, and certainly not a legitimate reason to force kids to go to that war. The only reason to go to war is self-defense, just like the only reason to intervene by force any time is to defend oneself or defend people from the initiation of force.
And maybe I'll say the last thing. Of course, in the Cold War, the example of Vietnam, or the Bush administration preemptive doctrine, self-defense can be incredibly broadly defined and may actually, justify intervention a long way if you see it as defending the country. Okay, thank you so much. Before I ask you to put your hands together for the two tremendous panelists tonight, I think it was really great, and I thank you all very much. Let me just make a quick plug for another event in this very room 2 weeks from tonight, Wednesday, April the 3rd at 7:30. Professor Luigi Zingalis from the University of Chicago will be presenting the 2013 John W. Pope Lecture that we hold every year annually at NC State. The title of Zingalis' talk is Capitalism for the People. It's going to be based upon a very well-received and very... If you enjoyed tonight, you will enjoy that. I would very much encourage you